introduce that we're recording this. And I'd also like to introduce our featured speaker, Bill McKibben. When our organizing group in Brattleboro started talking about the impetus for moving ahead and adding climate extremes to our agenda for organizing, after this summer's extreme weather, I think there's been a lot of impetus to join that fight. There's a lot of good work going on, but what we saw this summer was extreme heat, extreme wet, smoke from across the continent, and in other places, extreme dry. And the question we came to an easy answer that we need to join with all the work that's already going on. And if there's anybody who's been organizing this for a long time, it's Bill McKibben. At the time, one of our organizers is Reverend Ralph Howe from the Methodist Church. And I think he said, by the way, I think Bill's a Methodist. So just so you remember that, and we're not sure, but we may find out tonight. In any event, at this point, I would like to introduce Bill McKibben. Thank you, Bill, for coming.
Well, what a pleasure for me to get to join you, and greetings from Ripton and Addison County. And it really is a pleasure to get to be with you for a little while tonight. I am a Methodist, though I was baptized a Presbyterian and grew up in the UCC as a boy. Wherever I've lived, whatever the local strain of mainline Protestantism is, that's what I've engaged in. But I've been a Methodist for a long time and proud of it. I confess, though, I feel a little intimidated in this company because I've never risen any higher in the ecclesial hierarchy than Methodist Sunday school teacher. And even that at churches so tiny that the only prerequisite for service was, were you competent to take a tea towel and turn a third grader into a Palestinian shepherd on Christmas Eve? If you could pass that bar, you were pretty much in. So, you can consider the source when you're listening to me. I have over the years, though, gotten to do a fair amount of writing that reflects on the theological dimensions of our environmental struggles, and I've gotten to do a lot of organizing within that community. As a strong faith environmentalist wing has been built. It's not been my main work ever, but it's always been a part of my work. And I remember the very beginnings of it. 30 years ago, communities of faith did not really deal in the environment because in liberal churches, it was viewed as a luxury that you would get to once poverty and hunger and war were taken care of. And in conservative congregations, it was viewed as a way station on the road to paganism. So it was largely left alone. That happily has changed enormously. In fact, changed so much that I think it's fair to say that perhaps the most effective environmentalist in the world right now, or at least on the top three, is Pope Francis, who has made this an absolute center of his papacy and moved the Catholic Church in remarkable ways. I think the reasons why this is so important are hinted at by that introduction. I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then call the greenhouse effect, back in 1989. A book called The End of Nature that included a short meditation on the book of Job that I later turned into a long book on the book of Job. Because I think that climate change is the most serious practical problem we've ever wandered into. It also may be about the most serious theological and moral problem that we've ever wandered into too. This year, 2023, is the hottest year that we've ever recorded on this planet. We have records going back 200 years or so, But the scientists were able to extend that record by using proxies, glacial cores, lake sediments, tree rings. The scientists are very clear that this was the hottest year in at least the last 125,000 years. So that goes back well before the invention of monotheism, well before the invention of agriculture, well before anything that resembles a human society that we would really recognize anymore. We're living through historic times, and they are extremely painful times. The chaos caused by climate change is by far, by orders of magnitude, the largest thing that humans have ever done on this planet. The fact that we have managed to change the chemistry of the atmosphere and thus raise the temperature of the earth and thus begin already, even in the fairly early stages of the climate crisis, to melt the North Pole and increasingly the South Pole, and to change, therefore, the way that the jet stream and the Gulf Stream operate, and to produce uh, weather the likes of which we've never seen before, should be enough to kind of begin to clue you into the moral dimensions of this. Our floods here in Vermont this summer were the result of climate change. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That allows us to have bigger rainstorms than we've had in the past. In this part of the world, we've seen about a 60% increase in storms that drop more than 2 inches of rain over the course of a day. The storms that do no one any good and that eventually produce things like we saw this summer. That was terrible. I was through Montpelier today and it's still a ghost town, but it's nothing compared to what's happening in the rest of the world. In Libya, right about the same time, they had the biggest rainstorm they've ever had. It washed away 2 dams, and then it washed 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in the course of an hour. That's happening now all over the world. Fire, flood, drought, famine, all the kind of weather that we used to call biblical is now a standard staple of, and it is concentrated among the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. To take an example, the continent of Africa has produced about 2% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but they're having more damage than any other continent on the planet. The United States has produced about 25% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Though we're only 4% of the world's population. All the stuff that we've produced over the course of our lifetimes, you and me, is still up there trapping heat. The carbon dioxide that came out of the tailpipe of my family's maroon Ford when I was getting my learner's permit in 1974 is still up there in the air trapping heat. I'm not going to bother describing all the physical effects of climate change. I've written endlessly about it. Everybody's written by this point endlessly about it. You understand some of that. Let's think about the moral and indeed theological effects for a minute, or implications. The very first page of the good book, and the good book tends to be one of those books, I think, where more people read the first page than the subsequent ones, charges us above all with taking care of this planet that we've just watched its creation. Or its creation each day has been described as very good. That was the very first thing we were asked to do, and it may be the thing we've done the absolute worst at. We're now engaged in a rapid process of decreation. We're running Genesis in reverse, and we're doing it fast. There are 70% fewer wild animals on this planet than there were in 1970. The biologists tell us that because of climate change, we are faced with the 6th great extinction event on this planet. The last time we had one of these great extinction events, it was because a huge asteroid plowed into the Earth. This time, the asteroid is us. We are failing as stewards of creation, even though it was our first job. And if you are a New Testament reader, then it seems to me we're failing at least as eloquently at our most basic job as outlined in the Gospels, which is to love our neighbors. We are sickening our neighbors, drowning them, making it impossible for them to, uh, um, impossible to make make their living from the sweat of their brow because there's too much sweat on the brow. The World Labor Organization said that we're already at the point where humans are able to have had to reduce their outside work by about 10% because it's too hot and humid now in much of the world, and that number will be closer to 50% before this century is out. There's again nothing we've done that quite matches the scale of this. Every other thing we've tried to figure out how to make the lives of other people miserable around the world, imperialism and colonialism and racism and things, at least left people with a stable enough climate that if they had a small plot of land, they could figure out how to grow some food for their family, but that is no longer true. And as a result, all those other crises are being deeply, deeply exacerbated. Take immigration, for which you guys have done such good work on. I'm on the President's Council of the Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Settlement Services. We had a big national Zoom call today with a couple of congressmen. And I was pointing out that at this point, the number of immigrants and refugees coming from natural disasters, if you want to call them natural anymore, now outnumber the number produced by wars and conflicts and violence. And that is going to rise very dramatically over the next decades. The UN estimates that if we do not manage to dramatically check the pace of climate change, we're going to see somewhere between 1 billion and 3 billion climate refugees over the course of this century, because you simply can't, if you can't grow food anymore where you are, then you cannot stay there. But of course, there's no way that the world could actually absorb 1 billion or 3 billion climate refugees. We've seen what happens to the politics of the planet when you have 1 million people fleeing the Syrian civil war, or 2 million fleeing the violence and drought in Central America. Multiply that by 1,000 or two and try to imagine what kind of political chaos we inhabit. No matter what you're worried about, in fact, at this point, climate change has become the kind of root cause. The World Health Organization said that climate change is now the main driver on this planet of public health emergencies. For decades, we've managed to bring down the rate of malnutrition slowly but surely around the world until about 5 years ago when it began to tick up again because the rate of droughts and floods is now overwhelming our ability in many places to produce enough food and get it to people. You get some example of what I mean when you look at, say, what happened in Pakistan last year when they had the biggest flood on this planet probably since Noah. A third of the country was covered by water. 32 million people were on the move. That's the equivalent of everybody from Boston to Baltimore out of their homes. A year later, there's still widespread cholera. There's many, many farms that have never been able to get back in the ground, on and on and on and on. If I were forced to give a sermon about all this, and you should be grateful that you didn't ask me to give a sermon because I'm not a sermonizer, but I would refer to that story from the book of Job. I mean, you all know the story. Job finds himself, inexplicably cursed, and living on a dung heap on the edge of town and covered with oozing sores, and his flocks and his family are dead. And he demands that God come and give him an answer as to why. And this demand takes up 37 long chapters in Job that go over and over and over the same ground. And then, thankfully, for the course of the story, God does appear, speaking out of a whirlwind, delivering, I think, someone can correct me here, I'm sure, in this group, delivering what I think is the longest soliloquy that God delivers anywhere in the Bible, Old Testament or New. And it's the most beautiful, I think, the first great piece of nature writing in the Western canon, and probably the greatest, biologically accurate, crunchy, sexy depiction of this glorious, cruel, buzzing, beautiful, mysterious world. He talks about the ostrich and the eagle and the antelope. He says, just recounts their incredible beauties and glory. Even the ostrich, silly animal that steps on its own eggs, is redeemed by its pure speed, and it's a magnificent story. It's also the most sarcastic God ever gets in the Bible. He's basically taunting Job the whole time. If you want an answer to things, well, if you're so smart, you tell me. Do you know where I keep the snowstorm? Can you whistle up a blizzard? Can you tell the proud waves, here you shall break and no further? And after about 3 chapters of this, Job basically just says, sorry I asked. Can I sit down now? It's been enough for him. And it's had to be enough for all of us as humans for almost all of human history. We have been small in relation to the large thing around us, the enormous forces of the natural world. But all of a sudden, in the beginning, in the middle of the 20th century, that started to shift, and pretty dramatically. Humans suddenly got very large. The first intimation, of course, was the explosion of the first nuclear weapon at Alamogordo. And there was Oppenheimer quoting from the Gita, "We are become as gods, destroyers of worlds." But we had enough imagination, having seen the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to understand the terror of all that. And so far, we've managed to avoid a repeat. It's one of the few things that human beings have really gotten their act together on, again, so far. Our imaginations were not capable of understanding, it appears, that the explosion of 1 billion pistons in 1 billion cylinders every second of every minute of every hour around the world could wreak the same kind of havoc. But they have. That's what's melting the poles. That's what's driving, say, those extraordinary forest fires in Canada that burned 3 or 4 times more forest than has ever burned in a year before up there. I could multiply the examples, trust me, for a very long time. We're very big now. If God says to us, as he said to Job, can you tell the proud waves, here you shall break and no further? Job's like, yeah, that's your department. And we're like, no, we're figuring out how high the ocean's going to rise by what we decide to do. And I think that implies quite clearly that our job is to figure out how to make ourselves and our society a little smaller in its impact on the world. And happily, we have the tools to do that now. Over the last 10 or 20 years, people exercising their God-given wit have figured out, say, how to drop the price of solar panels and wind turbines 90%. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a water into wine miracle. It doesn't come at no cost. You still have to mine some cobalt and some lithium, and we need to do it as environmentally soundly and humanely as we can, but the effects are orders of magnitude smaller than what we do now. And all you need to do to understand that is to think about the difference between, say, mining lithium, which you then put in a battery where it does its work for a quarter century, and mining coal, where you immediately set it on fire and have to go mine some more the next day. we're at a point where we could realistically rely on the large ball of burning gas that the good Lord was kind enough to hang 93 million miles up in the sky, and that people of all religious persuasions have looked to as far back as we know, but now we can look to for the most practical of all commodities, the energy that we use every single day. We can capture its rays on those photovoltaic panels, and we can take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the wind that blows those turbines. And that means that we're capable of making dramatic progress fast. And fast is the key word here. Climate change is different from every other problem that we encounter in that it comes with a time limit. If you're used to that saying, that biblical adage that the poor you shall always have with you, not one of my favorite adages, I must say, this is the opposite of that. If we don't solve this very soon, we will never solve it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us we have 6 years to cut emissions in half if we're to have any hope of staying on the timeline that we set in Paris to hold temperature under some kind of control. 6 years by my watch, 2030. I mean, that's an eye blink away. And so the work that we have to do is enormous, enormous, enormous. But it's beautiful work. It's basically the substitution of energy from heaven for energy for hell. That's what we've been using for the last many thousand years, digging stuff up and setting it on fire. And now we can catch the rays of the sun and put them to good use, particularly put them to good use in the poorest parts of the world, which have no access to energy at all now, and never will if they're going to rely on building out a grid like the one that we have here. Instead, happily, and I've spent a lot of time in Africa watching this process happen, people are getting energy for the first time. Now 90% of people who get energy for the first time are getting it from renewable power, because solar panels are cheap and mobile enough to be in all kinds of places. So the possibilities for a transformed world are enormous and very, very beautiful. I'll just finish by saying what fun it has been to watch religious groups take on this question over the years. And I remember working with the very earliest efforts in the Jewish community, say, Shomrei Adamah, Guardians of the Earth, and then the Coalition on Environment and Jewish Life. And now I'm on the board of a wonderful group called Dayenu that has done a great job of organizing Jewish Americans for climate action. We've watched the Muslim community begin to take this on in powerful ways and discover the resources in their scriptures. As I said before, Pope Francis, following the lead really of Patriarch Bartholomew and the Orthodox Church, has become the most outspoken of climate activists. Truly, pretty much every tradition except evangelical Christianity has a certain amount to be proud of now, but there's a lot more work that can be done, especially in mainline Protestant communities, I think, to make this an issue that really matters. And the examples of things that we can work on are so easy. Here in Vermont, we have things like the fact that our pension funds are still invested in the fossil fuel companies that have been driving this crisis and spreading disinformation about it for decades. New York has already divested its pension funds, so has Maine and Quebec. Time for us to do it. That's what Third Act. Third Act is this group that I've formed all over the country in the last 2 years that organizes old people like me for action on climate change. If you come across any old people, you can tell them about it. It's been great fun, and we're doing all kinds of great work. And some days we're writing thousands of letters to the Department of Energy like we did last week, and sometimes we're going to jail like we did, last spring, taking on the big banks driving the climate crisis. There are 1,000 ways into this fight, but we need everybody in this fight. If I had a way to say it, it would be the planet is now way outside its comfort zone. So we need to be way outside our comfort zones trying to do something about it. And that should apply most powerfully to those of us who believe that we exist in some creation, that this world that we were lucky enough to be born into bears some evidence of divine intent, that it matters what happens to the planet in the largest sense. Um, I'll just say that I think it's the now the underlying issue on planet Earth, the lens through which to examine the planet and its crises and try to figure out how to solve them as best and as fast as we can. I think I've overshot my time here, which I that's why you should. Good thing I'm not a preacher, because I would just get wound up in the pulpit and keep going. And I know what it's like to have to sit through a slightly too long sermon, but you're very gracious to have indulged me all the way through. I'm going to leave now because we're in the middle of this huge fight about liquefied natural gas in the Gulf Coast, and I've got to go zoom in with a bunch of people in Louisiana and Texas in the environmental justice community fighting these things. But what a pleasure to get to be with neighbors and with co-religionists for a little while and just think about the possibilities for real moral witness in this most crucial and most timely of questions. So, it's been for me a slightly hard day in Vermont, because one of my very favorite Vermonters, Ken Squire, died today, and I've been thinking about him all day. And there was no one who had more of a sense of community than he did, and built more community than he did through WDEV. But that's why it's really nice for me to get towards the close of the day with another community of Vermonters and just be reminded that the thread is unbroken and on we go. So many thanks, y'all, very much.
Our plan was to take a little break right now, and for the people online, what we call a bio break, and then we'll resume. We have a panel which will give a presentation. So feel free to take a little break now. Restrooms are over on both sides, and we also have lots of refreshments here. So we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Melissa is back in Barry, and she's helping with the Zoom coordination on that end. So we're going to get started again now. And as we start the second part of the program, Reverend Ralph Howe has another reflection to offer for the group.
Thank you. I'm going to be reading from this book, which is Indigenous Theology and the Western Worldview, a Decolonized Approach to Christian Doctrine by Randy S. Woodley, who's an enrolled Indigenous theologian, I believe mostly Cherokee. And he has a little section entitled How to Make Change. An atmosphere that includes the following values can help foster long-term change. Relationship building, the most primary value. Trust building, which requires consistent honesty and leads to loyalty. Humor, especially laughing at our weaknesses and mistakes. Equality means treating everyone fairly. Empowerment, which means allowing for innovation and advancement. Diversity of opinions, which means providing safe space for difference of thought without threat. Appreciation of individual giftings, which means allowing for difference, showing appreciation in tangible ways, and facing risky questions together, even if sometimes expressed as unruliness. appreciation of out-of-the-box innovations, even when they are not a great success. Acceptance of both tradition and non-tradition. A verifiable communication tools and devices. And finally, vulnerability and acceptance of our common humanity, which we call grace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. And thank you for your work in helping organize with Vermont Interfaith. And I should say we have our organizing committee here, and I just want to recognize them quickly. It's Lisa Sparrow, and maybe one or two of you know her here. And in the back is Guy Wood, who is part of the Brattleboro area Jewish community. And Katie Berg is here too, from All Souls. And I'm Mike Merwicki from the Putney Quaker meeting. And I'm sorry, the guy who put everything here together, really, is Fred Bruning, also from Guilford Bridge. But thank you, Fred. At this point, we have a panel who are gonna each take a few minutes and share a little bit about what's happening, what they see that we can do from the ground level, perhaps up to the policy level. We have Senator Becca White up in White River Junction. Becca is the co-chair of the Legislative Climate Solutions Caucus. I think Dr. Becky Jones is there. She is. Hi, Becky. Becky is here from 350 Brattleboro. And we have Alex Wilson here as well, whose bona fides include environmental building with news. Alex has written numerous books, including some of my favorite on quiet water paddling. But Alex's connection to the environment and various work is well known. And I think we will start with Senator White.
Cool. Okay. Do I have, how much time do I have to speak to
10
you?
minutes?
15 minutes.
10
Okay.
minutes.
10 minutes?
10 minutes.
I'm gonna go for, okay, I'll try that. Let's go for that amount of time.
I know it's different in the Senate than the House, but let's try that.
Hey, come on, House members. I was one of you back in the day. I hear how it is. You go over to the green room and you're all different. Well, so I'm Becca White. I'm from Hartford, Vermont, and thank you for letting me zoom in. I would have taken my electric vehicle down, but I'm even saving the electricity to come down. So thank you for letting me do this over Zoom. I grew up here in Hartford, Vermont. It's a little village, and Wilder is the name. My faith background is basically the biggest blend of all possible faith traditions that you could get as a New Englander over the last 100 years. My mom is what she describes as a recovering Catholic, former Hare Krishna, and raised us as Buddhists. When I was growing up, my dad is a Protestant and my oldest brother is Jewish. So I have like a very interesting blend, and that's how I ended up being a Unitarian Universalist. So if you're a Unitarian Universalist, you probably understand a little bit about why that makes so much sense. But not only do I actively participate in my local UU, which is the Heartland, the first Unitarian, the first Universalist Society of Heartland, I also get to be a state senator. So as a state senator for the Windsor County area, I have been able to participate in a lot of different pieces of legislation that have supported responding to the climate crisis. I also serve as the co-chair of the Climate Solutions Caucus and the Futures Caucus, and both of those groups really have a stake when it comes to talking about climate change. I was really grateful that I was invited to join you tonight because what's interesting for me with climate change and the conversation around faith communities is that I come at it from a kind of like they build upon each other in my life in a way that is very, very noticeable. The way that I came to Unitarian Universalism after being in college, and prior to that, at the end of my high school career, feeling really alienated from religion and feeling really separate from kind of spirituality. The way that I found Unitarian Universalism was at the end of a exceptionally long week doing door-to-door canvassing for VPIRG. I walked to the end of Church Street, and literally it was the only thing open on a Sunday morning, my one day off. And I walked into the Burlington Unitarian Universalist Society's Sunday service. And while that service in and of itself was not about climate change, the whole congregation was at that time very concerned about climate change. It was like that was like their summer campaign, essentially. So being able to have a place of respite where I could talk about my experiences as someone who's like knocking on doors and being told that climate change wasn't real at some doors, or having the door even just slammed with before the conversation was had, having a faith respite was really valuable for me. And that was because although I'm an optimistic, upbeat person, I get pretty down when like especially at points when Bill was talking, I was like, oh, like this hill is a big hill, and I don't know if I've got the strength right now to think about climbing that hill. So having a faith community was really important to me and has been a big part of my activism, because if I didn't have that counterbalance of like that community, I would be afloat in complete pessimism and like inaction. So I have to have that to actually be able to even do this work. So that really brings me to the kind of two things I wanted to share with you tonight, which is why I think it's so great that you're doing this. And I just wanted to tell you why uniquely I think faith communities have to be a part of this movement. So even if you were kind of on the fence about it, why we have to have you in the mix, as a policymaker, why it's so important, and what you can do to actually move some of the policies that you want forward. So uniquely what you guys offer is you mobilize people. So people show up to events. And when we, or I as a politician, have had the experience of having people show up at stuff, that impacts how I think about that issue and how I weight that issue. And as Representative Merwicki can tell you, or former Senator Ingram can tell you, even like one person calling you up or showing up to an event has a magnifying impact on our decisions as legislators. Vermont is close. If your legislator could be your neighbor. So having a conversation with them, any kind of interaction, that has impact. So a faith community can mobilize people in very unique settings to have those conversations with their elected leaders. The second thing is you bring together a lot of people who might not interact on this topic. And I'm speaking mainly from an intergenerational standpoint, which is you may have caught on, I'm 29, I'm a young person, and I am unique in some respects in that regard at my church. Although everyone's young at heart, I have darker hair than a lot of the people that I go to church with. And to have an intergenerational conversation about climate change can be difficult for me, because I feel that I've met with some resistance, and that's a really hard conversation for young people to have. But in a faith setting, while my church is we're very active in this conversation, even in a faith setting where I've had difficult conversations like that, they've been better than conversations I've had that are difficult, not grounded in like a value set that we can all agree on. So you can, as a faith community, actually have those conversations with people, and bring together kind of unique parts of our community in a way that you might not have that conversation in other places. And then the last thing is that you as I think probably anyone who's a part of a faith community has experienced, if you have a profound spiritual connection to something, you're far more likely to act on that thing. um, and something that I have noticed as a politician is that my fellow politicians, lots of us are extroverts or connected to people. And when we feel called by a story, or we feel emotional, or we feel moved, that will actually get us to act. So when you can draw out those experiences in someone who's a politician or a policymaker, they're more likely to actually carry the ball forward on an issue, because it's not the statistics, it's like the story that we are so moved by for a lot of politicians. So those are really my 3 reasons that you uniquely as a collection of people can make a difference. And there's lots of logistical ways that you could do that, and kind of use that tool. But I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit. But I just want to end with one story, which is that kind of to wrap it all up is my grandmother is very Catholic, very Irish Catholic. And her opinions about my work, I worked for a solar company and then I worked for Efficiency Vermont. She didn't really get it. And Bill McKibben mentioned this, but the Pope coming out and speaking about the way that climate change is going to impact all people, it is what turned the light bulb for my grandmother on why my work mattered. And it was truly one of the first times that she kind of understood why I do what I do, and that it's not like a waste of my time. So those kinds of conversations can happen in a way that brings us together intergenerationally across faith backgrounds. And I think that that's the kind of stuff that actually gets any of the policy done. So thank you for listening to me. And I hope I didn't go over my time. So there you go. Okay, they see this. Yay.
And what I would ask, if you could hang around, and then there might be some questions later.
Of course. And I could talk about legislation too. So you let me know.
That'd be great. But at this point, Becky, are you ready?
Sure.
And I'm hoping you can share a little bit about how your work as a physician carries over into your work with 350 and what 350 is doing locally now.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It was really wonderful hearing Bill and Becca. You're great. I'm hard act to follow. So hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know, I'm a physician in Brattleboro, and I'm one of the members of the volunteer group 350 Brattleboro, which is a sort of an organization under the umbrella of 350 Vermont, which is under the umbrella of 350.org, which Bill McKibben and his friends started like 15, 20 years ago or more. So my work as a physician, gosh, I mean, I talk about climate change every day with my patients, most of whom bring it up with me, probably because they know I'm interested, but it certainly seems very relevant to emotional as well as physical health. So we end up talking about it quite a bit. And I certainly have the sense that people are more and more concerned about the issue. And so I feel very lucky to be able to have that discourse. And then with 350 Brattleboro, I would say that we're always trying to come up with our next project, and then our next project tends to insert itself because things keep happening around us. Often crisis-like. Right now, we're working on to join forces with folks protesting the Hanscom Field proposal to expand private jet opportunities. Private jets are a huge source of carbon. They kind of dwarf any efforts you or I or municipalities have to reduce carbon. So we're working on a project that I will plug right now. We're making a private jet piñata that we are going to offer to everybody to attack on the first Friday in Brattleboro. So it's gonna be really fun. But I guess what I would say is that fun is the word there. Our group really has fun together, and we create community together, and that's what keeps me going. And as Becca mentioned, and Bill did too, what's going to solve this is community. And the word community in faith-based communities is key. People coming together and supporting each other when some of us don't have the energy and others do. We can bring each other along. That's really what's going to solve this. So I just think it's so important that we come together and grieve together and motivate each other and have fun together and make songs together and make agreements. And so I invite you all to join us when you want, and also go to 350 Vermont, because the statewide organization is fabulous and is always coming up with amazing projects. And their website is very active and interactive. The project they're working on, or I should say we, because we're part of it too, are working on is to deal with the McNeil bio plant in Burlington. I deal with try to steer decisions away from expanding the biofuel plant up there. So there's always stuff going on, and please plug in at any time. So I'll leave it at that. And if anyone ever wants to talk climate change with me, I'm always happy to do so. So thanks so much.
Becky, if it's okay, and for all of you, after tonight, I want to put together some contact info. Is that something you're okay with sharing with the group?
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Excellent. So thank you very much. And we have our third panelist in person here. And Alex Wilson is someone I've known for a while, and actually knew his father first. His father, Conrad, was a longtime member of the Putney Quaker meeting, with an amazing history of his own that at some point we could, if you want to know more about it, I'd love to tell you. But Alex has built a career around how we can do things differently, how we can build differently, how we can, from the ground level up, how we can build our houses, our buildings, carbon free. I mean, that's not the terminology that was used in the past, but without any further ado, I will let Alex tell you more about his work here over the years, and what some of the things we might think about doing on an individual basis that can lead up to the policy decisions we hope to affect.
Great.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Mike. So I think I'll start by saying I'm not terribly religious. I grew up a Quaker. My father was active in the Quaker meeting in Pennsylvania. Quakers going back generations in our family. My father was a CO in World War II and really infused in me a caring for not only people but the planet. I became an environmental activist pretty early in life, late 60s. In 1970, I was the Earth Day organizer in my junior high school. I would take the train into Philadelphia to get mimeograph sheets to paste up in our school. And then, I learned a little bit about participating in the political process I think it might have been 1972, I worked with a state legislator in Pennsylvania to write a bill to ban DDT in Pennsylvania, actually preceding the federal ban of it. So that gave me a sense of how an individual, even a high school student, can, succeed in activism. I got involved with renewable energy a little bit later, looking at solar and wind and other renewables as something to be for instead of always fighting against things. And I think that was important to me and to my psyche. In the late 70s, began working for a nonprofit solar organization in Santa Fe, New Mexico after college. And then in 1980 was hired by a sister organization in Brattleboro, the New England Solar Energy Association, as executive director. I came into that right a month before Reagan was elected, and one of his first pieces of work was eliminating the solar programs at the Department of Energy that had funded the organization. And in a funny kind of way, that was a good thing in that it forced me as leader of the organization to really diversify our purpose. And we, shifted away from just looking at solar to focusing on energy efficiency, on building science, on quality construction, on other renewables, on indoor air quality and sustainability. And we actually renamed the organization the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association after absorbing a group in Philadelphia and another one in New York City. And it's since the organization is still going strong, it's now based in Greenfield. But I was director there for 5 years and then went out on my own to do writing. And I had starting in the 70s, begun doing writing and increasingly an increasing amount of writing. And I started my own company thinking I might be able to make a living as a writer. It's a pretty challenging field to succeed in. But I wrote a book, The Consumer Guide to Home Energy Savings, that came out, I think, in 1990, and was pretty widely distributed because public service companies would often buy them in bulk from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy that published it and give them away to electrical customers. But then I was doing freelance writing for a bunch of magazines and increasingly was being told to, write about structural insulated panels, but be sure to mention these 4 companies because they're advertisers. And I didn't like that. And whenever I had a chance with my freelance writing, I would focus on that intersection between the building industry and the environment. So in 1992, at our company, Building Green, we launched Environmental Building News, which was the first North American publication focused on, the emerging green building movement. And we pretty quickly got a national following and even had subscribers in maybe a couple of dozen foreign countries. But we didn't carry advertising, so we relied on subscribers to make it work. It was always touch and go. We never were a profitable company. We're still going in Brattleboro, about 15 employees, 35 years later or whatever it is. But my focus on climate, goes back, really to my early years. I was always fascinated by climate change, and I have in my library Congressional Research Service reports from the early 70s where the debate about climate change was going on. And it was really interesting. And there was a active debate at that time whether we were about to enter another ice age with global cooling or whether we would enter a global warming period. And it was a valid scientific debate that was going on. And some of the congressional reports are really fascinating to look back at today. And the pollution that we were putting in the atmosphere was reflecting sunlight away from the earth, having a cooling effect. And we now know that the greenhouse effect is overwhelms that, and the warming trend is preponderance, is much more important. But I mention that because when I'm speaking at groups around the country, and I'm doing less of that these days than I was, but if I'm in in Indiana or Ohio, red state areas, I like to talk about that story because I remember at a conference in, I think it was Ohio, I followed a climate scientist who basically was, preaching about how people that don't believe in climate change are stupid. And I could just see people being turned off. And, if we're going to solve the problems that we desperately need to solve, we need to get more people in the tent or under the tent to, to look at solutions. And that's why, I think the faith community is so important in this movement. Even though I'm not heavily engaged in that, my wife is a member of the UU Church. But I look to the faith community for being able to do what a lot of us activists haven't been able to do, because it reaches a different level of people in the country. And there's a great book I read when it first came out, E.O. Wilson's The Creation. E.O. Wilson, I wish I was related to him, but he died a couple of years ago, but was really one of my heroes, throughout my career. And he wrote this little book, An Imaginary Conversation Between Him and a Baptist Minister, talking about the creation and the need to protect creation, whether you believe in God or not. And it's a great approach to that. So I'd suggest you get a copy out of the library. I think I wrote my first article about climate change. It was called Cutting Carbon in 1989 for a magazine called Sanctuary, which sounds like a religious publication. It was actually the magazine of the Massachusetts Audubon Society that has a lot of sanctuaries around the state. But, I've really focused most of my career on practical strategies to lessen our impact on the environment, and increasingly focused on reducing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. So, I can talk specific solutions all day, from window technology to insulation materials to heat pump technology to electrification of buildings, but I think I'll leave it at that and participate in discussion as it continues. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And I hope, as I prepare something to send out to people, you might have some links in those regards that you can share for reference for folks. At this point, we have time for questions, time for some dialogue. And if there are people online, Melissa, if you could queue them up.
Yeah,
And
so Mike, if folks online have a question, if you all could just use the raise your hand feature, that would be the best, and I will call on folks as I see them come up.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any questions here people would like to put to our three panelists? Lisa.
The senator, or she represents
Becca?
Becky and Becca. Okay. Becca, you offered to tell us about some legislation that we might want to advocate for with our senators or representatives. I would love to.
And the governor.
And, Mike has got the talking point down, and the governor. That's great. Yeah, so I served in the House for 4 years. And so, yes, I'm proud to be a former representative, but I am a current senator. And so there's a few pieces of legislation that I would follow this upcoming year that are kind of in the works. But let me start by telling you about some legislation that you should be watching kind of come back around that we did this year. Which is, we passed the Affordable Heat Act, which built on the work that we did with the Global Warming Solutions Act. This group might know a lot about it, so I won't go too in depth, but essentially the Global Warming Solutions Act was Vermont's creation of a climate council, a climate solutions council that then proposed a climate action plan. And then that climate action plan within the Global Warming Solutions Act is our way of reaching our goals, ideally, to cut our emissions. We have specific targets based on years and based on sectors, and all of that is a requirement and not just a goal anymore because of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which means that there is a legal mechanism for Vermonters to actually hold our government accountable to ensure that we meet those emissions targets. So that's all great. So to help actually do that as a state government, we worked on the Affordable Heat Act. And the Affordable Heat Act is within the thermal sector, and it looks at reducing the thermal emissions that we as a state produce by creating essentially a way that fossil fuel companies have to participate in a market, a credit market, to then create incentives for those fuel reducing solutions like weatherization, like heat pump technology, like I think there was a reference of window technology, but maybe also like window dressers, you know, lots of stuff like that that we could be supporting with the Affordable Heat Act. That bill became law, and you may have heard a lot about it. And I'm really appreciative of the Vermonters who took information from good sources and not kind of the sources that were screaming from the rooftops that the Affordable Heat Act is going to raise your gas bill and you're going to lose the ability to heat your home. That's not what the bill did. So I would say follow what is going to happen in this, not this next year, but this next legislative session, which is that bill didn't actually become law. It basically turned into a study that the Public Utilities Commission has to do. And we have to do a whole new bill in one session from now. So I would say be on the lookout, not just this legislative session, but throughout the next year leading up to the election on how people are going to try to get you to believe that global warming is an issue that we can't solve, and that the people you need to be electing are people who will not actually implement the Affordable Heat Act. That is already being used to target legislators who supported the Affordable Heat Act. So please be on the lookout for that kind of messaging. Now, what we're going to do this legislative session is a little different. Because of the flooding, we've heard loud and clear that climate resilience is the thing that Vermonters want us to focus on. And that includes adaptation, mitigation, and creating all sorts of responses to the impacts that climate change has, while ideally putting in place solutions that would respond. So you're going to see a lot of bills on riparian buffers and river corridors and supporting Vermonters who were affected by flooding. And I would say that's the most important bill. If you're going to track something this legislative session, follow something that's tagged with climate resiliency, then divestment from our pensions from fossil fuel. There's a lot. But I don't know. That's what I know the Senate is we're noodling on.
Thank you, Becca. There will be a lot we can follow up on.
Hi, my name's Linda Hay. I live here in Guilford. I'm a retired school teacher. And as I looked at climate change and the life I would live in retirement, I was very lucky in that I inherited money from my parents a few years ago. And with it, I built the most energy efficient house I could. There's a foot of insulation in all the walls and more than that above the ceiling. I have heat pumps. I've built a solar greenhouse on it. I've done everything I possibly can. And this year, it was valued at more than $500,000 because that's what it could be sold for because it's so efficient. but I can't pay the taxes at that rate. And I was told that the legislature declared that for property taxes, the value had to be on what a house could be sold on. Not only did I build it so I could live the rest of my life without polluting. I'm sorry, I'm losing my memory. I built it with enough space that I could take in caretakers so that I wouldn't have to go to a nursing home, that I could be in that place for the rest of my life. So there are 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen. I live in a small cottage that's attached to it. And because of that, it's considered a 3-bedroom house, even though the cottage I built has, for my bedroom, a space that can't hold a double bed.
So your question is about the tax situation?
The tax situation
Yeah.
for people who do all the right things.
Sure. If you don't mind, what I can do,
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
you've got a wonderful legislator here in
Becca.
Guilford, Vernon, Sarah
Sarah.
Coffey. And what I can do is make sure she reaches out to you and explains what I think we could do or what's happening now, if that works for you. And
Thank
then
you,
I'll
that
share
would be
her
great.
information,
If
yeah.
I can comment on that, when I first moved here, must have been 1980 or 81, there was a similar issue where people were putting on solar collectors or other solar features and then being taxed on them, property tax, where the extra tax they were paying was costing more than the value of the energy saved. And I remember lobbying about that with the legislature, and I think, and I'm not remembering exactly, but I think there was passed an exemption for solar, at least for solar collectors and other renewable energy systems from that property tax. So, maybe there's a model for, ways that concept could be used for the more envelope strategies for reducing energy consumption.
Yeah, and one of the other things I would say that property taxes are based on income. So anyone under, I think it's now $140,000 a year in income gets a allowance for,
It wasn't very much.
yeah,
It was about $1,000
sure, yeah.
on a property tax
Yeah.
bill of $10,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whoa.
So if it's okay with you, I'll have Sarah get in touch with you. And
Yeah, thank
we'll see
you.
what we can do. Ralph,
I'm not sure that this is still the case, but I believe it is. That Vermont, does not require utilities to purchase excess generation from your solar installation or windmills or whatever on your property. Whereas other states are required to buy the excess. This has some challenges to the utilities, but it also can reduce the overall growth of more expensive and damaging production facilities and the need for peakers and that kind of thing. And maybe it's changed, but I looked into some solar recently for where I work, and they said, oh, well, no, we only build to whatever it is that your expected load, rather than what this space could produce for the grid, because we were not, quote, a community solar installation.
Yeah, I'm mildly chomping at the bit with this line of thinking because you've hit on a really important point that I did not talk about, which is we are actually going to be looking at the renewable energy standard, which is the set of policies that the situation you're describing is impacted by. The renewable energy standard has not been updated in Vermont in a long time. And it's essentially what provides the basis of our ability to have interconnected renewable energy on our grid. So you may be familiar with off-grid technology. Well, that's actually not where a lot of solar renewable energy lives. Almost all of it is on grid, meaning as the Reverend described, you are selling the power that you're generating back to your utility company. In Vermont, your utility company does need they do need to take the power from you if you're not going over essentially your capacity, so your credits expire. Is how it works, but that's through something called net metering. So what most solar companies will do is they'll build you a system that is large enough to actually generate enough credit so that you have like a peak of credit that you use throughout the year. So that you fill in kind of the winter and darker seasons with a peak of credits that you've saved and earned from your utility company during the summer months. That works well for a lot of places. Unfortunately, as we've just heard, the scenario where you have a big roof but not a big electric bill, and you're not necessarily a community solar array, which means that you're then having other off takers, other people who are taking the power. You're in a difficult situation. So there's a lot of things like that, like little cracks in our renewable energy standard that we didn't really anticipate when we developed the policy, or it wasn't clear what the impact would be yet. And we need to go back and solve some of those things. So that's something, I'm taking notes on that one in particular. I've heard it from churches because of your nonprofit status. You don't have access to a lot of tax credit, and some of that can deeply impact financing as well. So that's another angle. There's a lot of stuff. There's caps on how big something can be. And municipalities, for example, have caps. So for example, in my town in Hartford, we've hit our cap, but we want to build more solar.
Alex, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so, there are some challenges and some bugs we have to work out in the power purchasing arrangement statewide, but I think, looking at the bigger picture nationwide, we're really lucky to be in Vermont with Green Mountain Power in that they're probably the most progressive utility company in the country, at least of the larger investor-owned utilities. It's a B Corp. While you can't, make money easily selling extra power to the grid, you can designate the extra power you're producing to go to another customer on the Green Mountain Power system. Mm-hmm. So, for example, my wife and I generate more power than we need to power our house and our car. And we had bought a place in Brattleboro for her mother. So some of our excess power that we produce in Dummerston, gets allocated to our house in Brattleboro, which is, mainly a rental house most of the year. So there are some creative things that Green Mountain Power is doing that, unlike most utility companies, they also recognize the benefit to them of battery storage, and distributed battery storage as a way to avoid having to build new power plants and new distribution facilities. And some of you may have seen a recent announcement where they're wanting to make the grid more resilient by putting battery systems in homes around the state. So there's some really creative things that can be done, and there are ways to get around that problem of not being able to bank solar credits for more than a year that Becca talked about.
You have a question?
Yeah, so my name is Tyler, and I work in biodiversity research and policy, so that's my bias coming into this. But yeah, I think insofar as a crisis can have sexy branding, I think climate change has done a really good job. But yeah, my question for both the activists and the policymakers is, yeah, so we have climate change as this enormous crisis, but we also have triple crisis of biodiversity loss, we have pollution, we have climate change, and they're all interconnected. So yeah, as we think about environmental justice, how can we make sure we're not just prioritizing one element of the solution? We're going for a holistic environmental justice that includes all of these elements. Thank you.
Becky, did you raise your hand to answer into that?
No, I was just thumbs upping. Yeah, I completely agree. I would say that in 350 Brattleboro, we call it climate justice rather than climate change. And I've watched that evolution over the last 10 years of climate activism, recognizing that interconnected truth. So yeah, completely with you.
I was reacting to your question because that's like, I want to know the answer to that question as well in like a really succinct way. So if anyone has like a good sentence on it, I want to know. But I would say that the best way that we can kind of keep the policies that we're creating in response to climate change to be as equitable as possible is we need to have the people who are most impacted, who are experiencing those life circumstances in the decision-making place. Like they need to be at the table. And that means having them be elected or having them have access to their elected officials. And I'll just say what has worked well for me, just because you brought up marketing and like, how do we get people to show up for this stuff? Especially low income people. And I say this as someone who is low income. I say this as someone who grew up in poverty. The idea for a lot of low income people when they hear climate change or global warming is it light bulbs rich people elitism. And that is a problem that the climate change movement and like kind of environmentalism has had to hit for a long time, because it has made it so that we both prioritize a very interesting area of what we could be doing. Like we're not necessarily prioritizing people of color or low income people because they're not a part of the movement. And then people self-segregate out of it because they don't think that they're a part of it or that they aren't going to be included in the solutions. So it's kind of like a self-feeding problem. So what has worked for me, and this came up a lot during the Affordable Heat Act, was just speaking directly to the fact that I'm not just here to respond to climate change because I want to lower our emissions in the abstract. The reason that I'm here for climate change is because my mom pays a fuel bill and is dealing with fuel poverty right now. And fuel poverty is only going to get worse if people don't have access to clean technology and are like the last group of people to get access to the transition that we're all making. Rich people have heat pumps. Rich people are getting electric vehicles. Poor people need to be a part of the solutions as well. So that's kind of a framing that has worked well for me because it's my direct experience, but it also kind of changes the onus of like, where are people on this issue? If you can talk to them about how it does actually affect low income people, and it's not just like in my town, at least it's not just the people in Norwich or Manchester or Woodstock who care about global warming. It's the people in Springfield, Vermont, and in Hartford, Vermont.
Yeah. Becca, that's a great point, and it's something that we try and emphasize both in the Climate Solutions Caucus and the Social Equity Caucus to make sure that we recognize that climate change hurts lower income people, marginalized communities first and usually hardest. And we need to be intentional about making sure that that's accounted for. So there's a question in the back, and I think then we're going to wrap up because we're hitting our.
Mike, we have one question online first, or
Okay.
one comment. So from Bruce Westcott, he asked, have any of you heard about the soil carbon sponge? This is a point of agency for all of us to be a part of returning carbon to the soil. 90% of the planet's heat dynamics is controlled by water. The single-minded obsession with carbon dioxide is actually counterproductive. It is trying to get at the highest hanging fruit rather than the lowest hanging fruit, which is through growing plants that sequester water and carbon in the soil. This is something I have never heard Bill McKibben or anyone on this panel talk about. It is time for all of us to learn about the ways we can have considerable agency in this. Reducing emissions will take hundreds of years before the benefits will be measured, whereas the green and cooling the planet is something we can actually do. Many farmers are onto this, so it's an area of great commonality.
What I could say first of all is many of those practices are already incorporated in the recently renewed required agricultural practices in Vermont. And soil regeneration it makes sense on a lot of ways as good agricultural practices, good practices for protecting water quality, and also, as you noted for decarbonization. So it is something that's part of our agricultural policies right now. And decarbonization, carbon grabs are certainly something we're looking into, and we're taking one step at a time. So that is something I think we'll be looking at in the future. But you're right, it's not there yet as widespread as we want it to be. So thanks for pointing that out. So Fred, you had a question?
Yeah. Coming back to what you were saying.
And Fred,
Yeah.
can you speak louder
yes.
so people can hear you here?
He was talking about the interconnection of these different issues. And I love to think about interconnections because I think it's very empowering when you see how everything is related. One of my favorite quotes about that, just sort of as a note to end on, maybe, I think it's David Suzuki, the ecologist, said that religion and ecology make good partners because they're both about making connections. And then he points out that religion, Ray is about the ligaments of what connect. And so I think that's a perspective that can help us as faith communities see that everything is connected. And that also means that however we want to enter these issues, because each of us is going to have our own way, is going to connect with everything else. And I guess one of my hopes for our faith communities is that they can be communities of sharing, where we can see and learn from each other how our different concerns and interests are interconnected, and that they all work together for this solution.
Great points, and I would agree that, as was said earlier, community is what can help bring us together to move this forward, and those connections are going to be essential for us. So,
Mike, could I just build on that?
sure, if you could quickly, because we're going to wrap up.
Let me connect two big problems, housing and climate change.
Yeah.
And suggest that churches and other entities might consider promoting communal living that would bring people out of their private homes, give up their private homes, give up their private cars, live together like the monasteries of old, in the meaningful communal gathering that would be energy efficient, not only in terms of sources of energy, but less consumption of energy.
Yeah. And your point's well taken there. And it also folds into what we're trying to promote for planning in Vermont right now, which is clustered village development, is to stop sprawling and move us back into the more European models of having villages and preserving the outlying land. And it's something that we are in Vermont putting into play as part of our state planning policies. So thank you for that. And thank you to everybody. Thank you to people online. Alex, Becca, Becky, Bill McKibben, Fred, for all you've done, Katie, Guy back there, Lisa. Thank you, everybody. Please if you haven't signed up for the mailing list back there, we'd love to be able to send you a follow-up to this event and follow up on the idea of organizing, bringing together faith communities to join with, as Debbie said, the 70 other faith communities that are part of Vermont Interfaith Action. Together, cumulatively, we are a much more powerful voice if we work together. So as we move forward, thank you for coming, and we look forward to continuing to work on this.
Thank you, Mike.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Good
so much,
night.
Mike and everybody.
Bye.